Hello and welcome to this lecture on an overview of the topic of food safety. To start with, let's look at how many people are affected by food safety in the U.S. In the United States, it's the government agency, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, that's responsible for tracking foodborne illness outbreaks. And the CDC estimates that each year in the U.S., 1 in 6 Americans, or roughly 48 million people, get sick from some sort of food-based illness. Of those, 128,000 are hospitalized and almost 3,000 die. So you're much more likely to become sick from something that you ate as opposed to die from something that you ate. Although, as you will learn, some of these conditions certainly are fatal. There are a number of government agencies that play a role in monitoring the safety of the food supply in the United States. I mentioned the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. They're responsible for tracking foodborne illnesses and outbreaks. So if you reported that you ate at a certain restaurant and you got sick, and a bunch of other people ate at that restaurant that same day and got sick, and they all called it in, it would go to your local, and then maybe your county, then your state, but eventually, if enough people were ill, it would escalate its way up the chain to the point where the CDC, which is based in Atlanta, would investigate the outbreak to see maybe it was lettuce-based, and let's see where the actual contamination occurred, and then they would do the follow-up there to see what other groups might be affected besides just the people that ate at the restaurant that you ate at. Another government agency is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA plays two distinct roles in monitoring the safety of your food supply. They regulate pesticides, and they also establish water quality standards. The Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, is responsible for assuring the safety of foods sold in interstate commerce, with the exception of meat, poultry, and eggs. They are also responsible for regulating food additives. You'll see that meat, poultry, and eggs in a second falls under the USDA's jurisdiction. With regards to food additives, there's a number of different additives that you're allowed to add to foods. Let's say, for example, you buy pre-sliced apples. Those apples will likely have vitamin C or ascorbic acid added to them, because if you didn't add vitamin C, then the apples would turn brown when they're exposed to oxygen. So because vitamin C or ascorbic acid has antioxidant properties, it prevents the browning of the apples, and because it's safe when consumed in small doses, the FDA has approved vitamin C as a food additive for certain foods. There's many other food additives as well, and we'll learn about them later when we talk about altering the food supply. Foodborne illness is sometimes abbreviated FBI and is transmitted usually via food or water. You'll see when we study the different types of illnesses that most foodborne illnesses usually cause GI symptoms, so things like upset stomach, diarrhea, vomiting, and nausea. Foodborne illness is caused by microbes like microorganisms and their bacteria, viruses, different fungus, or parasites. Microbes that cause diseases are referred to as pathogens. Pathogens generate pathology or diseases. There are certain populations who are particularly at risk for developing foodborne illness. Now, certainly at a certain dose, anyone could become sick, but you're likely or more likely to see sickness in these at-risk populations: people who are ill, malnourished, or are immunocompromised. So, for example, if you have HIV and AIDS, or if you have cancer and you're undergoing chemotherapy or radiation. These things cause your immune system to be suppressed, such that even very small doses of the potential pathogen could make you sick, whereas a healthy person, it might not make them sick. Pregnant women, the very old, and the very young are also at increased risk for developing foodborne illnesses. So how do foodborne illnesses actually occur? You can become sick from foods through either the process of infection or intoxication. With foodborne illness infection, there's infectious agents that infect the tissue of the human body, and they multiply there. So examples would be things like salmonella bacteria or hepatitis viruses. With salmonella, most of the eggs that you eat in a food service operation, so if you went to a breakfast place and you had scrambled eggs, all of the eggs there are likely pasteurized eggs, meaning that the eggs have been heated to a certain temperature before they were even shipped to the restaurant, and that killed the potentially harmful pathogens. If you're cooking at home, though, your eggs are likely to not be pasteurized. So if you undercook the egg and you have a runny egg yolk, you would potentially run the risk of getting salmonella infection. Okay, now, of course, only a small percentage of the egg yolks would actually be infected with salmonella, but still, that actual bacteria that would make you sick from the undercooked egg yolk, that's an example of foodborne illness infection. On the other side, foodborne illness intoxication occurs when microorganisms like bacteria produce toxins like enterotoxins or neurotoxins. These are poisonous chemicals that the bacteria release as they multiply. So the toxins then get absorbed into the tissues and cause harm. It's not the actual bacteria that's harming you in this case, but rather the toxins that the bacteria is producing. And examples of foodborne illness intoxication include things like Clostridium botulinum or botulism and Staph aureus. Here's an example of how you might become ill from foodborne illness infection and intoxication. Let's use the example of a chicken pot pie prepared in a large casserole dish, maybe served at a cafeteria. The person who's serving the dish has unwashed hands, and your hands have all sorts of bacteria on them, including a number of different strains of staph. This particular worker has high levels of Staph aureus, and he's preparing and cooking and cutting the food without having washed his hands. He takes the food out of the oven, and even though it was heated to the right temperature, he puts it on the steam table, okay? And the food is left unrefrigerated. Okay? If it's not above 140 degrees, we see what's called the danger zone. The danger zone is the area of 40 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And if potentially hazardous foods like a chicken pot pie sit in that danger zone for too long, that's the ripe temperature for bacteria to multiply. So maybe he doesn't have the steam table set properly in the cafeteria. The food is left unrefrigerated for too long. The bacteria multiply in the unrefrigerated food and they produce a toxin. Later on, there's leftovers of that casserole and you heat it. And even though you heat it really hot, you kill the bacteria, but you don't kill the toxin that the bacteria has already made. When someone eats that reheated food, after 1 to 6 hours, they get things like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and stomach pain. Staph aureus, you tend to get sick from that a little bit faster than you do with a lot of the other foodborne illnesses. As you'll learn, with most foodborne illness, it's usually at least an 8-hour onset period. Okay, you don't walk out of a restaurant and throw up and say, oh, that food from the restaurant made me sick. It's usually 8 hours later you throw up and you start thinking, what did I eat 8 hours ago? Staph aureus, though, is a little bit quicker, somewhere between a 1 to 6 hour onset. Whether or not you get food poisoning, the symptoms and the severity will depend upon a number of different variables. Things like the potency of the contaminant, how much of that contaminant was consumed, how often you consume it, and then also your individual age, your size, your nutritional status, and whether or not you have a chronic disease. Remember, people with compromised immune systems, like the young, the elderly, the pregnant, and those with HIV and AIDS, those people are going to be most susceptible to getting food poisoning. There's also variations in the absorption, metabolism, and storage functions or capacities in your body. There are a number of different points along the food chain where you could potentially have interjections that would cause harm. So if we look at food and how it travels from the farm to our tables, note the variety of different places where there could be a compromise or breakdown in the system that could result in you getting sick. It's not just from somebody not washing their hands at the restaurant that you're eating at. Let's start at the farm. If farm workers do not use safe growing methods, harvesting, sorting, packing, storing, and all these different approaches to keep food safe, contamination hazards could arise. At the processing level, processors are supposed to follow FDA guidelines that concern contamination, cleanliness, and education and training of their workers to monitor for safety at what are called critical control points. And we'll talk about the critical control point program next. At the transportation level, if you're the one who's responsible for moving the food from the processing to the retail outlets, the containers and the vehicles that you use to transport the food have to be kept clean. Cold food has to be kept cold at all times. At the retail level, employees in grocery stores and restaurants have to follow the FDA's food code, and the food code teaches us how to prevent foodborne illness. Establishments have to pass local health inspections and train their staff in sanitation, but remember, a lot of the food that they maybe received could have potentially been compromised or contaminated if it was infected at the farm, processing, or transportation level. At the table, whether it's you eating at home or you eating in a restaurant, as a consumer you have to learn and use sound principles of food safety and stay mindful that foodborne illness is a real possibility. And actually, you're much more likely to get sick from foods prepared at home than you are to get sick from foods from a restaurant. I mentioned critical control points. There's a program called HACCP, and HACCP stands for the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. This is a very successful program in the United States that actually, since its implementation a few decades ago, has dramatically reduced the amount of salmonella and E. coli and other foodborne illness in our food supply. Even though people still do get sick every day, people still do die and become hospitalized from foodborne illness in the U.S., we have among the safest food supplies in the world. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that every step along the way, if someone is involved in food protection, they have to identify what are called critical control points as part of a HACCP plan. So this is a food safety system that is required for food manufacturers, processors, and distributors. They analyze the food production, the processing, and the transport of the food, with the overarching goal to be to identify potential sources of contamination and points where measures can be taken to prevent the contamination. So you identify the critical control point, and then you have a plan to make sure that there's no compromise in the system so people don't get sick because of that break in the system. You're constantly monitoring these critical control points. So I'll give you an example of HACCP at work. Just recently I was on a tour of an avocado packing plant in Southern California. And the avocado packing plant company had recently implemented and purchased a very large and expensive sanitizer and washing machine for washing the crates where the avocados come in from farms and then they get sent back out to other farms. They basically identified as part of their HACCP program that if you bring crates in from farm A, okay, and crates in farm A have been sitting on soil where animals go to the bathroom and rotten produce falls out of the trees and there's other potential contaminants, and that crate sits right on the ground, okay, and when it comes into the factory, it brings all of the potential contaminant stuff with it there. Okay, and if the crate is not washed and sanitized, when they send that crate back out to farm B, they could potentially be sending the contaminants from farm A over to farm B. So as part of the HACCP program, they actually sanitize and wash all of the crates to certain specific temperatures and parts per million, etc., in order to assure that they're not the break in the chain and they're not the ones who are proliferating foodborne illness. So that's an example of the HACCP program, and it's a critical control point program. If you're interested in learning more about food safety, there's a number of different tests you can do for your home. Here's one from Rutgers University, How Food Safe is Your Home Kitchen. There's a lot of information on the IFIC, International Food Information Council, page about food safety. A good tutorial on food safety myths from the University of Nebraska, going through 10 commonly held food safety myths. Foodsafety.gov has a really good interactive tool called Ask Karen, and she's an avatar that you can type in questions about food safety and she'll give you the lowdown on food safety. The USDA has an Is It Done Yet program, kind of teaching you how you can't eyeball whether or not food is done. You need to be using a thermometer. And then lastly, there's a professor from UC Davis who's made some of the kind of more boring side of food safety fun by teaching about food safety through different music videos.